After my father-in-law's funeral, my jobless husband turned to me with a smile that felt like a slap. He said the will left him $1 billion, then told me I was useless now, and walked away. I signed the divorce papers with shaking hands, still in my black funeral dress. I thought the betrayal ended there. It didn't. 24 hours later, in a lawyer's office smelling of old paper and cold coffee, my ex-husband demanded access to his inheritance. The lawyer didn't even hide his smirk. "Did you even read the will?" he asked. And when he read it out loud, I watched my ex's face drain to pure white, because the will said something he never expected, something only I knew, and it changed everything. My name is Luxara Vale, and before I share what really happened, I'd love to know you're here with me. Comment hi, or tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes just knowing someone is listening makes a story like this a little easier to tell. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If this story stays with you, breaks your heart a little, or reminds you of your worth, please consider subscribing. It means more than you know. By the time the last black umbrella disappeared into the Seattle drizzle, my feet were numb, and my coffee was stone cold in my hand. I was still standing where I'd been for most of the afternoon, a few steps away from the framed photo of Harlan Dempsey, my father-in-law smiling in a navy suit frozen forever in better days. The funeral home smelled like lilies and wet wool. People had cried, hugged, shared stories. For Harlan, those tears were real. For his money, the whispers were even louder. I kept catching bits of conversation drifting past me as guests shuffled toward the doors. I heard his estate's close to $1 billion. Well, Chase finally hit the jackpot. Each time I heard Chase's name paired with jackpot, something sharp twisted in my chest. I'd lost a man who had become a second father to me, someone who talked to me like an equal, trusted me with his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes. Meanwhile, his only son floated around the room like this was a celebration of his coming into power. I watched Chase bounce from group to group, laughing too loudly, clapping people on the back, like he was at a cocktail mixer, not his own father's funeral. Dad planned everything. He bragged to one of Harlan's old business partners, swirling his drink. From here on out, I've got to learn how to live like a man who's actually as rich as people think he is. The man he was talking to gave a tight, uncomfortable smile and glanced in my direction, then away, like he didn't want to get involved. I caught that look more than once. From a cousin, from an aunt, from one of Harlan's longtime lawyers. A mix of pity and resignation, as if they'd all tried to steer Chase before and finally given up. I wrapped my hand tighter around the coffee cup, more for something to hold than to drink. The liquid was lukewarm and bitter. I felt like a stranger wearing the title Mrs. Dempsey, watching a family politely implode around me. And yet, under the grief and exhaustion, there was something else, the memory of late-night talks with Harlan in his office. His voice low as he said, "Money is loud, but character is what lasts after the noise fades." He had worried about what would happen when he was gone. I had worried too. No amount of worrying had prepared me for how fast Chase would prove us right. When most of the guests had left and the parking lot outside was a blur of taillights in the rain, I stepped out under the awning to get a breath of cold air. My head was pounding. My eyes burned from crying. I just wanted to go back to the hotel room I'd booked, just in case, crawl under a blanket and stare at the ceiling. Instead, I heard my name slurred just enough to warn me. Lux. I turned. Chase was standing in the doorway, tie-loosened eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with grief. He still had a half-empty glass in his hand. "Come here a sec." Before I could answer, he closed the distance, clamped his fingers around my wrist, and pulled me toward the parking lot. A couple of his cousins stood off to the side, smoking under the overhang, conversation dying as they watched us pass. The rain misted against my face as we stepped out from under the light and into the dim, slick space between rows of cars. My heels slipped a little on the wet pavement. "Chase, what are you?" "We're not doing this in there." He cut me off, jerking his chin toward the funeral home. Then he reached into his coat pocket and slapped a stiff stack of papers against my chest. Here. Sign. I looked down at the papers, then back up at him. My brain was slow from the long day, from the grief, from the cold. It took me a second to process the word at the top of the first page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. What is this? My voice sounded flat, distant to my own ears. He grinned, and I hated that I knew that grin. It was the same one he used when he landed a sale when he'd charmed someone into giving him what he wanted. It's the end, babe. Clean break. He swayed slightly, the ice in his glass clinking. Dad left me $1 billion. 1 billion. I don't need you anymore. You've served your purpose. You were a bridge. Training wheels. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. The words hit harder than the number. I'm useless now. I repeated slowly, tasting the metallic tang of humiliation in my mouth. That's what you're saying? I mean, yeah. He shrugged as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. You were a good safety net while he was still alive. Now he flicked his fingers as if brushing crumbs off a table. You're just extra. For a second the world narrowed to his face, his smug little smirk, the way the rain beaded on his dark hair. I thought about the months I'd spent covering his credit card bills, calming calls from collectors, the late nights I staggered home from work to find him on the couch, controller in hand, while his father slept upstairs. I thought about Harlan's apologetic sighs. He wasn't raised to be this way, Lux. I don't know where I went wrong. I thought about the way Chase was talking about his father now, like the man's entire life had been one giant delayed wire transfer for him. Anger shot through me so fast my fingers tingled. I wanted to slap the glass out of his hand, to scream, to tell him exactly what I thought of his selfish little fantasy, but another voice cut in. Harlan's from one of those late nights in his office, the lamp casting warm light over old blueprints and newer spreadsheets. In big decisions, stay calm, he'd told me. Anger wastes energy. You'll need that energy later. My jaw tightened. I drew in a slow breath that tasted like rain and asphalt. You already filed these? I asked, flipping the stack open with fingers that only shook a little. Every line had been filled in, every box checked. He'd planned this. Not today, not in the wake of fresh grief, but long enough ago to sit down with a lawyer, draw up the terms, decide exactly how much I would be walking away with. Spoiler, not much. I scanned the sections. The house. His car's his. Shared accounts. Minimal and already bled dry. My name was on nearly nothing but my personal belongings, and some vague mention of premarital assets not contested at this time. He had built himself a safety net out of me and then cut me out of the picture as soon as his imagined payday arrived. My hand found the pen clipped to the folder. I uncapped it. The plastic felt too light, too simple to be the thing that would officially end my marriage. I signed anyway. Luxara Vale. Each stroke felt like slicing through some stubborn, tangled rope. When I was done, I closed the folder and shoved it back at him hard enough that he had to take a step backward to keep his balance. You file it, I said quietly. Ship my stuff when you're done. He blinked, thrown off by how easy it was. Maybe he'd expected tears, bargaining a scene. Instead, he'd gotten my signature and my silence. You're not going to fight me on this? He asked, almost offended. No, Chase. I turned away, the hem of my black dress catching a small puddle. I don't fight over garbage. Behind me, I heard his cousin's muffled voices, cigarettes hissing in the rain. I didn't look back at them or at him. As I walked toward the street, pulling my small suitcase from where I'd stashed it earlier in the day, a cold little smile flickered just for me, just for a second. He thought he was the only one who knew about his billion. Thought he was the only one who had sat across from a lawyer and talked about Harlan's estate. He hadn't bothered to read the documents he'd been so sure were written in his favor. I had. I'd sat with Harlan in his office for hours listening as he outlined exactly how he wanted his money handled, how he wanted his name to live on. I knew that $1 billion was not what Chase thought it was. I knew Chase was walking straight into a wall he didn't even see coming. The tension of that secret hummed under my skin as I dragged my suitcase across the wet pavement. I stepped to the curb called a rideshare, and when the car pulled up, I slid into the back seat without glancing over my shoulder. As we pulled away, I looked through the rain-streaked window one last time at the funeral home, its lights glowing dimly against the gray. In my head, I spoke to the man whose photo still sat inside. "I'm sorry it came to this, Harlan. I really am. But you prepared for this day, and so did I." Capitol Hill. I told the driver, giving him the address of a cheap hotel I'd booked that morning before the funeral, before the divorce papers, when all I'd had was a bad feeling and a habit of planning for worst-case scenarios. He nodded, turned on the wipers, and carried me away from the Dempsey world and whatever version of it Chase thought he now owned. The hotel room was small, the kind of place business travelers use for one night and forget by the next city. But to me, that night it felt like a lifeboat. A single bed, a narrow desk, a lamp, with a yellow shade that made everything look softer than it felt. I closed the door behind me and leaned my forehead against it for a second, listening to the muffled hum of the hallway. My black dress was still damp at the hem. My hair smelled like rain and funeral flowers. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally slipped off my heels. My feet ached in that deep, bone-tired way that comes from more than just standing too long. I looked down at my left hand. The ring caught the lamplight. A simple band. Nothing flashy. Something I'd once thought meant forever. I twisted it off slowly, feeling the faint groove it left on my skin. Today I'd lost my father-in-law to a heart that simply gave out, and my husband to a heart that had probably been empty for a long time. Two different kinds of grief stacked on top of each other until I felt crushed. For a moment, everything blurred. The bland hotel art on the wall, the rumpled bedspread, my own hands. Somewhere between anger and numbness, my mind did what it always does. When reality feels like too much, it retreated. Slid backward away from the parking lot, and the divorce papers, and the billion-dollar lie back to another phone call, another worst day. I was 23 again, standing in a cramped kitchen in Tacoma barefoot on cold linoleum holding a chipped mug of cheap coffee. My first husband Eli had left for the construction site before sunrise, kissing my forehead and joking about how one day we'd upgrade to a place where you couldn't hear your neighbor's TV through the walls. The phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in my chest clenched anyway. I remember the sound of the woman's voice more than her words, the professional flatness as she said accident scaffolding collapse critical, and then, not long after, I'm sorry. By the time I got to the hospital, it was already over. They let me see him for a minute, tubes and wires still tangled around his body, his face eerily calm. I touched his hand, and it was already cooling. After that, the days smeared together. People brought casseroles and sat on our sagging couch and said things like, "He's in a better place, and you're young. You'll move on," as if grief worked like a software update. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. The color drained out of the world. Walking through our little apartment was like walking through a museum of a life that had been shut down overnight. His boots by the door, the dent in the pillow where his head used to be, the coffee mug he favored with a tiny chip on the rim. All artifacts now. Then came the paperwork. Insurance forms. Company statements. Numbers attached to the worst day of my life. Between Eli's life insurance and a settlement from the construction company, I ended up with about $550,000. People hear that number and think lucky, but it didn't feel lucky. It felt dirty, like money soaked in the dust and blood of the site where he died. When Eli's parents called a family meeting, I braced myself for a fight. I told them we should split the money, that it was only fair. His mother took my hands in hers, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "No," she said. We're old. We have each other. What we need is to know you're going to be okay. His father nodded, jaw tight. He loved you. He'd want you to have a chance at a life that isn't just surviving. Use it for that, not for us. In the end, they agreed to take a small portion, enough to cover some lingering medical expenses and set up a scholarship in Eli's name at the local community college. The rest they pushed back across the table to me. I left their house that day a widowed 20-something with more money in her account than she'd ever seen, and less will to live than she'd ever imagined possible. Tacoma, with its familiar streets and shared memories, became unbearable. Everywhere I turned, I saw ghosts. The diner where we'd argued about whose turn it was to do laundry, the park where he'd first told me he loved me, the bus stop where we'd waited huddled together in the rain. So I packed up what little we had, gave away the furniture we'd bought together, and moved north to Seattle. I rented a tiny apartment near downtown, the kind where the walls were thin and the view was mostly brick and alleyway. I threw myself into work at a mid-range software company, taking every client call, every extra demo, every impossible target, as if exhaustion could drown out pain. Mornings, I'd still find myself automatically pulling 2 mugs from the cabinet and scooping coffee grounds into the machine for 2, only to stand there staring at the second empty cup, feeling that same hollow ache widen in my chest. One night, sitting cross-legged on the floor with bank statements spread around me, I stared at the numbers tied to Eli's death. 550,000. I divided it into columns, some into a long-term investment account, some into a savings buffer, some into a small emergency fund. I watched the totals rearrange on the screen, but the feeling didn't change. This is the last money anyone dies for in my life, I whispered into the quiet. No one touches this. No one uses this. Not ever. Not a boyfriend. Not a husband. No one. It wasn't just a financial decision, it was a vow. That vow lived in the back of my mind like a watchdog, shaping how I looked at relationships at risk, at the way people talked about money. For a long time, there were no relationships to test it. It was just me, my grief, my spreadsheets, and the endless churn of work. Then, 2 years later, my manager asked if I'd be willing to go down to Portland to present at a tech conference. You're good in front of a room, he said. And we need someone who can make our integration platform sound less boring. The conference center was all glass and steel and neon-lit signage buzzing with people in lanyards and branded hoodies. I stood at the front of a breakout room talking through cloud migration and API reliability to a crowd that was more interested than I expected. Among them, leaning casually against the back wall, was a man I didn't know yet. Tall, dark hair suit, just a little too sharp for the occasion, smiling like he owned the space. When I made a joke about legacy systems being like that, one ex who refuses to leave your Netflix account, he laughed, a quick, bright sound that cut through the usual polite chuckles. After the session, he pushed through the small crowd that had gathered with follow-up questions and waited until I was free. You made middleware sound sexy, he said. That's a superpower. I rolled my eyes, but I smiled. I'll add it to my resume. He stuck out his hand. I'm Chase Dempsey. I'm with Northline Solutions. We've partnered with your company on 2 deals this year, but we've never met. The last name hit me in a vague, distant way. I'd heard Dempsey in local real estate news, in stories about developments and community centers. At the time, it was just another Seattle name. We ended up at the hotel bar that night. 2 salespeople comparing notes about nightmare clients and impossible deadlines. Somewhere between my second drink and the bowl of stale bar nuts, the conversation shifted. He asked how long I'd been in Seattle. I told him. I mentioned Tacoma, then Eli, then the phone call, the hospital. I didn't mean to share that much. Grief is messy, and I'd kept mine locked up for so long that once the door cracked, it all wanted to tumble out. I waited for him to flinch, to change the subject, to offer one of those empty, "I'm sorry for your loss" lines people throw like band-aids over gunshot wounds. Instead, he went quiet and let me talk. When my voice wobbled, he threw in a small, harmless joke about how, if there was a support group for people who answered life-changing calls in ugly pajamas, he'd definitely be in it. It wasn't cruel or dismissive. It was just enough to make me exhale something that sounded dangerously like a laugh. Your husband was lucky, he said, finally serious again. To have someone who cared enough to still talk about him like this. Then he tipped his glass toward me. For what it's worth, I suck at relationships. I get dumped faster than a bad Tinder date. He said it with a self-deprecating grin, and I found myself wanting to know why. Later, walking back through the hotel lobby, he told me about growing up as Harlan Dempsey's only child. About a mother who'd left when he was young, chasing a life of luxury Harlan refused to bankroll. About always feeling like he was standing just outside his father's shadow, trying to prove something he couldn't quite name. There was real hurt in that story, a kind of abandonment I recognized in a different shape. I'd been left by death. He'd been left by choice. It made me soften toward him in ways I didn't fully understand. One night, after a long day of meetings and too many drinks, we were back at the bar. The room spun just enough that my filters loosened. I mentioned offhand how I'd used part of Eli's insurance to wipe out my student loans and the debts we'd carried into our short marriage. So at least the bank stopped sending me hate mail, I joked weakly. Chase tilted his head, watching me over the rim of his glass. And now he asked lightly, "You still have some of that safety net left?" The question slid past me in the moment, coated in casual curiosity. "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "Enough that I'm not going to starve if I lose a job. Not enough to retire to Maui." I laughed it off. I didn't see the way he mentally filed that answer away, not as a painful piece of my past, but as a data point. Over the next year, we built something that on the surface looked a lot like love. We saw indie bands in cramped venues on Capitol Hill, shouted conversations over loud guitars, shared fries in greasy diners at midnight. We walked along the waterfront, hands shoved into our pockets against the wind, trading stories about childhood, about career dreams, about all the ways life hadn't gone according to plan. He remembered small things, I said. My favorite coffee shop, the fact that I hated cilantro, the way certain songs made me think of Eli, and mirrored them back in ways that felt like care. He texted good luck before big presentations, sent memes when he knew I was stressed, listened when I vented about impossible clients. Slowly, I stopped feeling like a widow drifting through a city that didn't know me and started feeling like a person again. About a year after that first conference, we were back in Portland for another event. Same city, different hotel, a little more shared history between us. After the last session, he led me up to a rooftop bar, the kind with string lights and overpriced cocktails, and a view of the river cutting through the city. The air was cool, and the sky was that hazy gray that never quite turns fully dark. He took my hand, eyes searching my face with a seriousness I wasn't used to from him. "Lux," he said, "we've both spent a lot of time in the dark. You with Eli, me with my family, my past." He squeezed my fingers. "What if we stopped wandering around alone and actually built something together? A real family. With each other." My heart stuttered. Part of me screamed that I wasn't ready, that the scar from my first marriage was still too raw, that forever was a word I no longer trusted. But another part, the part that was tired of going home to an empty apartment, of pouring coffee into 2 mugs out of habit and dumping one down the sink, leaned toward the warmth he was offering. He pulled a small ring box from his pocket. The ring inside wasn't huge, wasn't flashy, but it was simple and sincere, and held between hands that in that moment I wanted to believe I could trust. "Marry me, Luxara," he said. "Let's stop surviving separately and start living together." Tears pricked at my eyes. I said yes. Standing there on that rooftop in Portland with the wind in my hair and the city lights blurring below us, I believed I was choosing a man who understood loss the way I did. I believed we were 2 broken people deciding to make something whole. What I didn't know then was that somewhere under all that charm and shared trauma, he was already doing math. And I wasn't just a woman he loved. I was a widow with a savings account he'd already started factoring into his future. The day we drove out to Medina, the sky over Seattle was its usual soft gray, but everything in me felt loud. Chase turned off the main road into a quiet neighborhood where the houses were half hidden by old trees and expensive landscaping. When we pulled into the driveway of the Dempsey house, I actually forgot how to breathe for a second. It wasn't some gaudy mansion with columns and fountains. It was glass and cedar and steel, low and wide, facing straight out over Lake Washington. The lawn was trimmed within an inch of its life, the beds lined with river rock, the kind of place that whispered money instead of screaming it. Chase killed the engine, grinned over at me, and said, "From now on, this is our home. Our home." The words landed with equal parts excitement and pressure. I was about to live not only with my new husband, but with the man whose last name showed up on half the development signs in the region. I smoothed my skirt, told myself to smile, and followed Chase up the stone path to the front door. Harlan didn't meet us there. He was in the great room, sunk into a leather armchair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a blanket over his lap. When he stood with effort as we walked in, I saw how thin he really was. Shoulders a little rounded, movements careful. But his eyes were bright, sharp, and when he smiled, it reached all the way up to them. "I'd get up and give you a proper tour," he said, extending a hand to me, "but my back and I are in negotiations." His voice was warm and dry, with that scratchy edge older men get. "I'm just grateful you're here." He didn't ask if I cooked, or how I felt about cleaning, or any of the things some fathers-in-law think they're entitled to quiz their sons' wives about. Instead, after we sat down, he looked right at me and said, "So tell me about your clients. Are you mostly selling SaaS into B2B or B2C?" I blinked, then laughed. "Mostly B2B, healthcare, logistics, a few banks trying to pretend they're startups." He nodded like this confirmed a theory he'd already formed. "And your platform's doing direct integration, not reselling from the couch." Chase groaned. "Dad, please don't subject her to your inner nerd." But I leaned forward, engaged, because it felt good to talk about something I was good at. We ended up in a half-hour conversation about cloud strategy and how small businesses got crushed in the shift to subscription models. Harlan kept up easily asked pointed questions, even mentioned an article he'd read on vertical-specific software plays. He understood my world more than Chase ever had. For the first time since moving in, I stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like someone invited for what I could bring, not just who I'd married. That night in the guest room that would soon become our room, Chase lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. "I've been a crap son," he said abruptly. "Always running around chasing deals, chasing fun, leaving him to fend for himself." He rolled toward me, eyes suddenly soft. "I'm gonna quit my job. Stay here. Take care of him full-time. You shouldn't have to worry about money anyway. You make plenty. Let me do this." Every instinct I had about financial independence twitched, but the picture he painted, a son making up for lost time with his aging father, tugged at the part of me that still believed in redemption arcs. "Are you sure?" I asked. "You won't miss work?" He shook his head. "I'd regret not being here more. I can always go back later." It was the moment I quietly shifted from building a life with someone to silently underwriting his. For a while, it didn't feel like a mistake. I'd leave for the office in the morning, driving across the bridge while the sun came up over the lake, and come home in the evening to a house that smelled like food and furniture polish. Chase would have dinner on the table. Nothing fancy, but warm pasta, roasted chicken chili in a big pot. Harlan would be in his chair, TV murmuring in the background, telling stories about deals he'd done in the 80s, about turning a derelict strip mall into a community hub. We'd eat together, Harlan asking questions about my day, teasing Chase when he overcooked something, the three of us falling into an easy rhythm that felt almost like the family I'd lost. But even in those early months, there were hairline cracks. I noticed Chase's wallet once when it fell open on the counter, stuffed with receipts, punch cards, old parking stubs. It looked less like a wallet and more like a trash can that had given up. At the grocery store, his card got declined twice. He laughed it off with a joke about the bank not being ready for this level of masculinity and handed over a different card. One night, as I was coming down the hall, I heard his voice from the study, pitched low and angry. I said, "I'm sending something. Stop calling me at home, you're freaking people out." There was a pause, then sharper. "I know what the interest is. I'll handle it." I slowed, listening, then forced myself to keep walking. "He's stressed," I told myself later, lying awake next to him while he snored. "He's adjusting. He's caring for a sick parent. Don't nitpick." The person who left me no room to nitpick was Harlan. He started inviting me into his office after dinner. The walls were lined with framed photos, ribbon cuttings at community centers, playgrounds filled with kids, affordable housing complexes that actually looked safe and clean. He'd point to each one like they were his children. "That one there," he said once, tapping a photo of a low, sunlit building with bright murals, "used to be a condemned warehouse. We put in classrooms, a kitchen, a gym. Best money I ever spent." He didn't light up when he talked about profit margins. He lit up when he talked about kids having somewhere to go after school besides the streets. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he told me more than once, looking over his glasses at me as we reviewed paperwork or watched the evening news. "Don't let anyone, including my son, drag you down to their level of impulse." His honesty always carried a thread of sadness when he said Chase's name. About a month into our new life, the shine started to fade. Chase began sleeping later and later. The caregiver picked up more shifts. Where he'd once driven his father to physical therapy, he now ordered a rideshare and told the caregiver to handle it while he caught up on things. Dinner, which used to be sizzling in pans when I got home, turned into cardboard takeout boxes on the counter. Cold fries congealed under flimsy lids. One Friday, exhausted from a long day of client meetings, I pulled into the driveway and saw a sleek, gleaming shape in the garage. It was a restored vintage Mustang cherry red paint, so glossy it reflected the rafters chrome polished until it hurt to look at. Chase stood beside it with a chamois cloth, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Remember I told you about my dream car," he said. "Well, dreams do come true." My stomach dropped. "Whose car is that ours?" he corrected. "I mean mine, but..." "Come on, isn't she beautiful?" Later that night, my phone buzzed with a fraud alert email from the bank. Multiple large transactions on a card I didn't remember authorizing, all tied to my savings account. When I dug deeper, my blood ran cold. A second card had been issued on my account, same bank, different number, Chase's name. In the last few weeks, $70,000 to $80,000 had evaporated into restoration work parts, a specialist, and a handful of high-end purchases that had nothing to do with the car. Electronics, clothes, dinners out I hadn't been invited to. When I confronted him, the anger in my throat tasted different than anything I'd felt before. "You opened a card on my savings." I held the printout between us like evidence at a trial. Without asking me, he didn't flinch. "Lux, relax. I just moved some of it forward. It's all going to be ours anyway. Once I inherit this, we'll all look like tip money." He said, "Inherit like most people say, next paycheck." Every word he spoke was a slap against the promise I'd made to myself alone in that Tacoma apartment. No one dies for me again. No one touches that money. I went into the bedroom and closed the door so he wouldn't see my hands shaking. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, mascara, smudged jaw clenched, and realized this wasn't just about cash. It was about how he saw me, not as a partner, but as a resource to be mined until something better came along. A few weeks later, I heard shouting from downstairs, Chase and Harlan voices overlapping. I froze halfway down the steps. "You don't need that much just sitting there," Chase was saying. "You're not doing anything with it." "It's not sitting," Harlan countered. "It's working. It's funding programs. You're not taking a dime out of those accounts." Chairs scraped. A door slammed. That night, Harlan asked me to come to his office. He looked more tired than usual. His shoulders slumped, the lines around his mouth deeper, but his eyes were as clear as ever. "Chase doesn't understand what I've built," he said quietly. "He only sees the number, not the shape of it." He folded his hands, looked at me in a way that made me feel both seen and tested. There will come a day when he finds out how things are actually structured. He's going to be angry. Very angry. He held my gaze. "When that day comes, I need you to be calmer than he is." I thought he meant Chase would be upset about not getting some ridiculous lump sum. I nodded, told him I would try. I didn't yet understand that I was being invited into a role that went far beyond daughter-in-law. That night, lying in bed listening to Chase snore beside me while the house hummed quietly, I felt like I was standing on a narrow strip of land between two continents. On one side, Harlan, who had awakened my sense of responsibility and reminded me that my mind was worth as much as my heart. On the other, Chase, the man I had chosen, who made me feel cherished and then entitled himself to everything that came with me. If I'd stepped back, then really studied the way he looked at money, at me, at his father's legacy, maybe I wouldn't have ended up in a parking lot after a funeral signing my name on the end of our marriage in a black dress. But I didn't step back. I stayed. And things only got worse. The slide from "this is hard" to "this is wrong" didn't happen in a single day. It was slow, like watching a house settle, until one day you noticed the crack running down the wall. Chase started sleeping through Harlan's morning routine entirely. The caregiver would arrive, let herself in, and handle everything from breakfast to medication, while Chase snored behind a closed door. The physical therapy appointments that Chase used to treat like sacred, "We have to keep him strong," he'd said early on, became optional. He'd wave a hand from the couch and tell the caregiver to take an Uber with Harlan while he stayed home to coordinate bills or deal with paperwork. Most nights when I came home, the kitchen counter was buried in greasy paper bags and plastic containers, low-end delivery from places that got our address wrong half the time. The dining table was a mess of crumbs and unopened mail. The warmth that had once greeted me was gone, replaced by the hollow noise of a TV playing to no one. I'd stack the containers, wipe the counters, and tell myself he was just overwhelmed. It's a phase, I'd think, as I loaded the dishwasher. Losing independence is hard. Caring for a parent is hard. He's just coping badly. I clung to that explanation until the night Harlan closed his office door behind us and set a thick file folder in front of me. "I need you to see this," he said. His tone was different, stripped of the casual humor he usually used to soften hard topics. He slid the folder closer. "Everyone thinks Harlan has $1 billion, like it's a pile of gold in a cave," he said. "That's not how this works. Inside were financial statements, trust documents, charts of accounts. Dempsey North Star Foundation appeared on almost every page. The headline number," he said, tapping a column with a knuckle, "is about $1 billion. Assets, commitments, endowments. But it's not a check with my name on it. It belongs to the foundation. Real estate we hold for community projects. A reserve fund that spins off grants. Money earmarked, locked, promised." My eyes skimmed lines I'd never seen before, properties titled in the foundation's name, endowment funds, with strict spending rules, notes outlining commitments to schools and youth programs. "There are personal accounts too," he added. "But not like Chase thinks. Enough to live decently, to cover care, to leave something modest behind. I've put almost everything else into this." He leaned back, watching my face. "Chase has never read any of this. If it doesn't fit into a line on a checking app, he loses interest." I swallowed, the weight of the folder heavy under my palms. "Does he know about the structure at all?" "He knows I have money," Harlan said bluntly. "He knows people call me rich. That's about it." He smiled sadly. "He does not know what it costs to build something that lasts beyond you." Over the next hour, he told me stories I hadn't heard before. About bailing Chase out of credit card debt in his 20s, only to watch him rack it up again. About the young woman Chase had dated for 2 years, who emptied her savings on a can't-miss investment he'd pitched her only to watch it implode. About the time Harlan offered Chase a role helping oversee a new community center, and Chase quit halfway through, bored, leaving the team scrambling. "He's not evil," Harlan said, voice low. "He's careless. That might be worse when you hold other people's lives in your hands." He rubbed his chest, wincing a little, then steadied himself. "If my son-in-law were someone else, someone like you, maybe I'd rest easier. But we play the hand we're dealt." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written across it in his neat, old-fashioned script. "I'm not being dramatic," he said. "My health is heading in one direction. I want my affairs in order. I've spoken with my lawyer. I want you to sit in on the meetings. Help me make sure what I intend is what happens." My fingers tingled as I took the envelope. "What do you want me to do?" "Be present," he said simply. "See the documents. Ask questions. And one more thing." His gaze sharpened. "Chase doesn't get to touch this process. He doesn't get to sway it with sweet talk or tantrums. You keep him out. You understand?" I nodded, the responsibility settling on my shoulders like a weighted blanket. I was used to handling contracts for software, not end-of-life papers that would determine the course of an entire foundation and a family. Still, there was no part of me that wanted Chase anywhere near that table. Harlan leaned back, exhaustion flickering across his face. "I trust you more than I trust my own son in this," he said. That's not something I ever thought I'd have to say out loud. A few days later, on my lunch break, I logged into our joint account to move some money around and nearly choked on my coffee. New charges had appeared on an account I hadn't touched in weeks. Thousands of dollars at an electronics store, a high-end VR gaming system, airline tickets to Las Vegas, hotel charges, all on a card linked to a checking account we technically both had access to, but that I'd treated as bill pay only. When I dug into the details, I saw it a secondary debit card issued recently, same account, Chase's name. He hadn't even bothered to mention it. That night, I waited until he was in the living room, eyes glued to some esports stream, surround sound rumbling. I stood between him and the TV holding the printed transactions. "Did you open a new card on our account?" I asked. He sighed dramatically, hit pause, and leaned back. "Lux. I told you I'd handle things," he said. "I just needed easier access. It's all the same pot." "You spent thousands of dollars," I said, my voice too calm even to my own ears. "VR gear, flights to Vegas, electronics we don't need, on an account we use for bills." He rolled his eyes. "I'm inheriting $1 billion, Lux. Do you hear yourself? Tens of thousands are nothing in the big picture." It's like you've never heard of scale. The casual disrespect in his tone made something in me go cold. "What exactly has your father told you about his money?" I asked. "Beyond the rumors." Chase laughed, a short, derisive sound. "He doesn't have to tell me anything. I've lived in that house my whole life. I know what those properties are worth. I know what the papers say." He flicked his hand, dismissive. "Old man doesn't trust anybody. But at the end of the day, I'm the only kid. Who else is it going to?" I thought of the file in Harlan's office, of the way his name appeared as trustee, not owner, of the legal language that would lock Chase out of decisions he thought he'd be making. I thought of the envelope with my name on it, the meeting scheduled on my calendar with Harlan's lawyer. I also thought of the way Chase was looking at me right then, like I was the one being unreasonable for not wanting our utility money blown on his distraction of the week. "You keep spending like this," I said quietly, "and there won't be anything left of my safety net by the time that inheritance fantasy gets tested against reality." He stood up, stepping closer, his jaw tightening. "Your safety net," he repeated. "We're married, Lux. What's yours is mine. That's the whole point." I didn't argue. I was past the point where arguing did anything but make him louder. Instead, I backed out of the room, heart pounding, and went upstairs. That night, after he fell asleep with the TV still flickering downstairs, I sat at the small desk in our bedroom and opened a fresh notebook. I started writing down every transaction I could see, color coding what was mine, what was shared, what was clearly his. The numbers added up to more than money. They painted a picture of a man who believed the future owed him a payout, and everyone around him was there to float him until it arrived. As I drew a line under the last entry, a chill walked down my spine. Chase wasn't going to stop at draining our accounts. He'd already tried to pry open his father's. He would push as far as he could with anyone who let him. And sooner or later, once Harlan was gone, and the truth about that $1 billion hit him, he was going to explode. I didn't know exactly how yet. I just knew with a certainty that made my hands shake that I had to be ready. Harlan's decline came in inches, not miles. At first, it was little things. He moved slower, took longer to get up from his chair, rubbed his chest more often when he thought no one was looking. Then the pill organizers on the kitchen counter multiplied. Morning meds, afternoon meds, night meds. A schedule taped to the fridge in thick black marker. I watched him shuffle down the hall with the caregiver at his elbow, and every time he winced, something clenched in me. Chase's patience shrank in almost perfect proportion. Where he used to joke with his dad, he started snapping. "You already took that pill," he'd say, even when the caregiver gently corrected him. "You're being stubborn on purpose." Harlan would fall quiet, eyes flicking to me with a trace of something I hated seeing there: fear. The man who had built half a city suddenly looked like he was tiptoeing in his own home. One afternoon I came home early from a client visit. The house was unusually quiet, no TV, no clatter in the kitchen. As I passed Harlan's office, I noticed the door was cracked open. Through the gap, I saw Chase at the filing cabinet, hunched over a small silver key in his hand. His shoulders jerked when he heard my footstep. He spun around, face pale, eyes wide. The drawers behind him were yanked open, folders pulled out and stacked messily on the desk. "What are you doing?" I asked. For a heartbeat, he looked like a kid caught stealing from a cookie jar. Then his expression hardened. "Relax," he said, sliding a manila folder back into the drawer with exaggerated calm. "I was just checking on things, making sure Dad's not being taken advantage of." I glanced at the chaos behind him. By whom? His color-coded labels. He forced a laugh, shut the drawer, and pocketed the key. "I'm his son," he said. "I have a right to know the state of our future." Our future? Not his father's? Our. Only I was pretty sure I wasn't included in that pronoun anymore. A week later, Harlan's attorney called and asked if I could come into his Bellevue office without Chase. The request alone made my stomach tighten. The office was on a high floor, all glass and steel, and tasteful art that probably cost more than my car. The attorney, a measured man in his 60s named Walters, shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. He opened a leather-bound folder, then looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Dempsey has asked that I go over some provisions with you," he said. "He wants you to understand exactly what's in his estate plan." I braced myself for numbers, for assets and allocations. Instead, Walters turned to a page midway through the document and slid it toward me, tapping a paragraph, highlighted in yellow. "This is the part he was very specific about you seeing," he said. I read it once, then again, my brain tripping over the language. It was dry legal phrasing, but the meaning was crystal clear. If within 3 years of Harlan's death Chase divorced me, abandoned me, was found to have abused me, or otherwise treated me in ways spelled out in excruciating detail, his rights to any personal inheritance and to any leadership role in the foundation would be revoked. Those rights would transfer to me. I stared at the page until the words blurred. He wrote this?" I asked. Walters nodded. "On his own initiative," he said. "He believes his son's judgment is compromised. He trusts yours more. He wanted a safeguard that would both protect you and protect the foundation from impulsive behavior." I thought back to every lecture Harlan had given Chase about responsibility, every warning he'd murmured to me in that office. He hadn't just been complaining, he'd been planning around his own son. So if Chase walks away from me after Harlan dies, I said slowly, he walks away from everything he thinks he's entitled to. Correct, Walters said. And if he behaves, stays married, treats you well, he retains what modest personal provisions there are, and he can apply for a role with the Foundation's board. Harlan wanted to reward growth, but he also wanted to account for the possibility that his son does not grow. I leaned back, feeling the room tilt. Does Chase know any of this? No, Walters said firmly. Mr. Dempsey was explicit. He did not want his son altering his behavior just long enough to secure a signature. He closed the folder. He also asked me to give you a copy to keep in a safe place, in case anything happens to the original. When he slid the copy across the desk, the paper felt heavier than it should have. I tucked it into my bag with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt two things at once, a grim kind of gratitude that Harlan had taken steps to protect me, and a cold threat of fear. If Chase ever found out I knew about this, I wouldn't just be his disappointing wife. I'd be the person standing between him and the fantasy life he'd already started spending. That night, cleaning up our bedroom, I found more proof of exactly how far he was willing to go. Tucked behind his nightstand was a small stack of envelopes, half open, some with red letters screaming "past due." Payday loan statements, high-interest quick cash with obscene fees, screenshots on his phone of a group chat with old buddies from his early 20s, bragging about a sure-thing crypto play that had apparently already tanked. Investment contracts with amounts circled that made my head spin. It wasn't just my savings he was using like play money. He was borrowing against a future he didn't actually have yet, assuming after the funeral would wipe everything clean. When I confronted him, I didn't soften my tone. Were you ever planning on telling me you owe money to half the predatory lenders in King County? He was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone and looked up slowly. Something in his eyes had changed lately. Less charm, more edge. I have things under control, he said. You're overreacting. I dropped the stack of envelopes in front of him. You're not under control, I said. You're underwater. You've spent my savings, you've taken out loans, and you're gambling on money that isn't in your name. His jaw clenched. It will be, he snapped. After Dad's gone, everything's mine. I'm just moving the timeline. He's not dead yet, I said, voice low. He's upstairs, breathing, hearing you talk like this. He stood palms flat on the counter. For the first time, the way he looked at me wasn't annoyed or dismissive. It was hostile. Don't talk to me like I'm some child, he said. I've carried this family for years. I've been the one here. You get to run off to your job and play hero while I deal with doctors, bills, his moods. If I want to spend a little against what's coming, I will. You should be grateful I'm thinking about our future at all. Our future. His tone made it clear I was no longer a co-owner of that phrase. After he stalked out of the room, I found Harlan in his office, sitting in the half-dark with the lamp off, hands folded in his lap. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. He's been bringing me papers, Harlan said quietly when I stepped in. Things he wants me to sign. Changes, he calls them. Updates. I told him no. He doesn't like hearing no. He looked up at me, and there was no mischief in his eyes, only worry. Those documents, we went over the ones Walters showed you. Those are the only ones that matter. You keep that copy safe. The real file is with Walters, and he knows not to release anything without my explicit say-so. If Chase waves something in front of you with my name on it, you bring it to Walters. You don't let my son pressure you. You hear me. I hear you, I said, and meant it. I stepped out onto the balcony after that, the cold evening air hitting my face. Lake Washington stretched out below, a black mirror broken only by ripples of light from distant boats and houses. The wind cut through my sweater, raising goosebumps on my arms. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared into the dark. Somewhere inside that beautiful house, a man I admired was trying to safeguard a legacy built on decades of work and service. Somewhere else in the same house, his son was tearing through credit and favors like kindling, convinced the fire would never touch him. And there I was, standing between them, holding a piece of paper that could decide which one of them shaped the future of everything Dempsey had built. The battle in that family had already started. We were just waiting on the moment it would explode into something none of us could ignore. The morning it happened was unremarkable at first. Seattle gray coffee brewing, the quiet shuffle of the caregiver coming in through the side door. I stood at the counter, half awake, watching the machine drip when I heard the caregiver's footsteps pound back down the hall, faster, lighter, wrong. She appeared at the kitchen entrance, eyes wide, face drained. "Lux," she said, voice shaking. "He's not waking up." The mug slipped a little in my hand, hot coffee sloshing over my fingers. I didn't even feel the burn. I ran past her up the hall to Harlan's office, the room he loved more than any other in the house. He was in his chair by the window, just like always, blanket over his legs, head tilted back slightly. For a second, I let myself believe he'd just dozed off reading. Then I saw the color of his skin. Too pale, too still. I grabbed his wrist. No pulse. "Harlan," I said, my voice breaking. "Harlan, come on." I shook his shoulder gently, then harder. Nothing. The caregiver was already on the phone with 911, reciting the address, the symptoms. I pressed trembling fingers to his neck, my chest tight, my throat closing. "Please," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. The paramedics arrived quickly, but not quickly enough to change anything. They checked what I had already felt exchanged, that look people in their line of work must exchange a dozen times a day, and one of them gently told me there was nothing more they could do. They gave me a minute alone. I sank down beside the chair and laid my forehead against his hand, the same one that had patted my shoulder when I closed a big deal that had tapped charts as he explained the foundation's plans. The grief that hit me was raw and immediate. With Eli, shock had numbed everything before the pain set in. With Harlan, there was no buffer. I knew exactly what I was losing. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the paramedics to speak to the caregiver, for someone to leave a preliminary note on the counter, for the house to fall into a strange, suspended quiet. The front door opened again. Heavy footsteps. Chase's voice, too loud for a house that had just lost its center. "What's going on?" he called. "Why are there sirens out front?" I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stepped into the hallway as he came toward the office. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the paramedics packing up, the still shape in the chair, the caregiver hovering in the background. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders dropped in a way that read, less like grief and more like relief. So he said, exhaling, "I guess this is it." My stomach lurched. "That's your father," I said softly. "He died." He didn't look at me. "Yeah," he answered. "And that means everything starts now." There it was. No pretense, no attempt at hiding the calculus he'd been doing for months. In the same room where Harlan had explained how every dollar in the foundation was spoken for his son, was already mentally cashing checks that didn't exist. Before I could respond, he was pulling his phone from his pocket. He didn't call the funeral home. He didn't call any of the aunts or cousins who'd want to know. He dialed his own lawyer. "Hey, it's Chase," he said, turning away slightly as if privacy mattered now. "Yeah. It happened. I need you to get the paperwork ready. We're going to need to do a full accounting. I want to see everything I'm entitled to." I heard only one side of the conversation, but it was enough. "No, not Walters," he said with a humorless laugh. "I'm not letting Dad's dinosaur handle this. I want someone who works for me." He paced while he talked, stepping around the paramedics as if they were furniture, the word estate already on his tongue. The rest of that day blurred into logistics, signatures, arrangements, phone calls to family who cried in my ear. I ordered food, no one ate. I found the black dress I'd worn to too many funerals in my life and hung it on the closet door, knowing I'd be putting it on again far too soon. Chase, meanwhile, tried on suits in front of the mirror, checking himself from different angles like he was preparing for a gala instead of a memorial. First impressions matter, he said, when he caught my look. People are going to see me as the head of this family now. The funeral itself was chaos wrapped in ceremony. People streamed into the funeral home, faces I recognized, and faces I'd only ever seen in framed photos on Harlan's walls. Business partners, community leaders, kids who were no longer kids, now grown adults with stories about what his community centers had meant to them. They shared memories at the podium, their voices cracking. I sat in the front row, hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my fingers went numb. When it was Chase's turn to speak, he kept it mercifully short, hitting all the right words. Visionary provider pillar. But never once sounding like a man who had actually listened to the lectures that came with those titles. After the service, people milled around the reception area, balancing tiny plates of food and paper cups of bad coffee, their voices hushed but buzzing. I heard my name occasionally paired with murmurs of sympathy. I heard Chase's more often paired with speculation. He'll be set for life, someone said, near the doorway. One kid, all that money, must be nice. As the crowd thinned and the funeral home staff began gently nudging people toward the exits, I busied myself with details, talking to the director about paperwork, making sure Harlan's sisters had rides home, checking on the caregiver who'd loved him in her own quiet way. I was wiping down a table stained with spilled coffee when Chase appeared beside me, hand closing around my elbow. His grip was just a little too tight. "We need to talk," he said, smile fixed as a few lingering family members glanced our way. "Now." He didn't wait for my answer. He steered me through a side door, down a short hallway, and out into the parking lot. The rain had started again, light, but steady, beating on the hoods of cars and flattening my hair against my face. A couple of relatives stood under the awning, smoking, their conversation fading as we passed. At the far end of the lot, Chase stopped, reached into his suit jacket, and pulled out a manila folder. He pressed it against my chest the same way he had once shoved unpaid bills into my hands. "Sign these," he said. My throat tightened. "What is it?" Even though I already knew. "What do you think?" he asked. "It's time to make this clean. You and me were done." He flipped the folder open so I could see the top page. The heading blurred a little in the dim light, but the words were unmistakable. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He'd filled in everything just like I remembered from the version he'd handed me in the rain in my memory. Only this time I saw the whole setup, the timing, the calculation. "You picked today," I said slowly. "Of all days." "Today is when it makes sense," he replied. "Dad's gone. I'm about to inherit. I can't have extra complications attached to me when I start fresh. You understand." His tone suggested I should be grateful he was explaining it so plainly. "You told me you didn't need me anymore," I said. "That I'd served my purpose." He shrugged. "I'm just being honest. You were there for the lean years. I appreciate that. But from here on out, I've got different plans, bigger ones. You don't fit in them." The humiliation washed over me again, sharp as the first time. Behind us, I could feel eyes on my back, the subtle shift of people pretending not to stare. Somewhere in my bag, folded and hidden, was the copy of Harlan's will clause. This moment right here in a wet parking lot behind a funeral home was exactly what he had predicted. "Fine," I said, and my voice surprised me by not shaking. I took the pen, clipped to the folder. The pages were the same as before, nothing of value coming my way. No mention of the years I'd spent holding things together while he fell apart. I signed where he'd marked my name, flowing across the lines like a farewell. I handed the folder back to him. "You file it," I said. "Ship my things when you're done." For the first time all day, he seemed thrown. "You're not going to argue, ask for anything?" No, I said. I don't want anything from you. I turned back toward the building, toward the few people who still lingered, then kept walking past them to the street. My suitcase was already tucked just inside the side entrance, packed that morning before we left the house. I'd known in some part of me that I wouldn't be going back there no matter how the day ended. As I rolled it toward the curb to wait for my ride, rain soaking through the shoulders of my dress, I felt his gaze on me from across the lot. If he'd looked closely, he might have seen that there was no despair in my posture, just a strange, steady calm. If he'd stepped close enough, he might have heard the words I was saying silently to myself, like a promise. Go ahead, Chase. Walk away. Call your lawyer. Demand your billion. I'll see you in the reading room when the papers you never bothered to read finally speak back. If he had really looked into my eyes that day, he would have known I wasn't broken. I was waiting for the will to be opened, for Harlan's last safeguard to click into place, for the moment my ex-husband would realize that in cutting me loose at his father's funeral, he had also cut himself off from the future he'd been building in his head since he was a boy. The day of the will reading, Bellevue was wrapped in rain and glass. Walter's conference room was all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows, the city outside smeared in gray. I took a seat near the corner of the long table, hands folded in my lap, the copy of the will clause resting like a phantom weight in my bag. I already knew how this ended. I just didn't know what his face would look like when it hit him. Chase arrived late, of course, pushing through the door in a perfectly tailored navy suit. Watch, gleaming hair, a little too carefully styled. He nodded at the two board members from Dempsey North Star Foundation and gave Walters a curt handshake. He didn't look at me. Not once. He sat down squarely in the middle of the table, legs spread, shoulders back, like this was his coronation. So he said, forcing a smile, "Let's make this efficient. When can I access the main account? I know the headline number." Walter's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat, broke the seal on the envelope, and began to read. His voice took on that slow, deliberate cadence lawyers use when every word matters. He went through the standard language: first debts, funeral costs, minor bequests. The room grew quieter with each paragraph. The foundation board members listened with grave attention. Chase's smile slowly thinned into impatience. Finally, Walters turned to the section that had been highlighted for me weeks before. Regarding the bulk of Mr. Dempsey's estate, he read, valued at approximately $1 billion in assets and commitments. I watched Chase straighten, chin lifting a little. These assets are to remain within and under the control of Dempsey North Star Foundation. They are not bequeathed to any individual. They are held in perpetuity for the purposes outlined in the Foundation Charter. The words landed like a stone in still water. What? Chase barked, half rising from his chair. That can't be right. I'm his only son. Walters looked at him steadily. The properties, investment accounts, and endowments that make up that figure are owned by the Foundation. Your father formalized that years ago. You may apply for an executive role within the Foundation subject to board approval and receive a salary like any other officer. You do not personally inherit those assets. The board members remained silent, but I saw one of them fold his hands a little tighter. Chase sank back down, stunned, then tried to regroup. Fine, he said, jaw tight. So what do I get? Personally, Walters turned a page. After paying outstanding medical expenses, tax obligations, and certain small bequests, Mr. Dempsey leaves to his son, Chase Dempsey, the sum of $75,000 in cash. Chase stared at him. $75,000? He repeated as if he'd misheard. Yes, Walters said. 75,000? A flush crept up Chase's neck. That doesn't even cover what I've already. He cut himself off, glancing at the others. His eyes were wild now, darting between us like he was looking for a hidden camera. Walters did not give him time to regroup. He turned to the final section. There is one additional provision, he said. Mr. Dempsey was very clear. This be read in full. I felt the air in the room thin out. In the event that within a period of 3 years following my death, Walters read my son, Chase Dempsey, divorces, abandons physically or emotionally, abuses or otherwise, egregiously mistreats his lawful wife, Luxara Vale, all rights he may have had to any personal inheritance, and any eligibility he may have had for leadership or employment within Dempsey North Star Foundation shall be revoked. Those rights and eligibility shall transfer to my daughter-in-law, Luxara Vale, who I trust to administer my legacy with integrity. The words hung there heavy and undeniable. Chase went absolutely still, like someone had punched the air out of him. Then slowly he turned his head and looked at me for the first time since he'd walked in. His eyes were full of disbelief and something darker. "This is a joke," he said, voice rising. "She doesn't deserve anything. I'm his son. She manipulated him. You—" He jabbed a finger toward me. "You talked him into this." Walters shook his head. "Mr. Dempsey drafted that language himself," he said calmly. "I sat with him through dozens of revisions. Ms. Vale was not present for those meetings." "That's a lie," Chase shouted. "You all wanted to cut me out. You've been planning this." I felt every pair of eyes brush over me. My heart hammered, but my voice when it came was steady. "You handed me divorce papers at your father's funeral," I said quietly. "You told me I was useless. You chose to end our marriage that day. No one forced you." Walters nodded. "The court received your filing 2 days after the funeral," he confirmed. "By the terms of this document, that act triggered the provision. You relinquished your rights under the will, Mr. Dempsey." For a moment I thought Chase might lunge across the table. His hands curled into fists on the polished wood. Then something in him seemed to fold. His shoulders dropped. He stared down at the papers as if they were in another language. "One other matter," Walters said gently. "Per the same provision, and with the concurrence of the board, Ms. Vale will assume an interim stewardship role related to the foundation. Not as an owner," he glanced at me, "but as a guardian of Mr. Dempsey's stated mission and intent. Mr. Dempsey's son will not be considered for employment or leadership at the foundation for the foreseeable future due to concerns about judgment and ethics." One of the board members cleared her throat. "We all respected your father, Chase," she said. "We intend to honor his wishes as written." Chase pushed back his chair so abruptly it scraped against the floor. For a second he just stood there, breathing hard, eyes unfocused. Then he stalked to the door, yanked it open, and disappeared down the hall without another word. Silence settled behind him. Walters closed the folder and placed his hand on it for a moment as if in benediction. I sat there, pulse pounding in my ears, looking at the bold black letters of Harlan's name on the cover. In that room, with rain tapping against the glass and the city blurred beyond, I felt his presence more clearly than I had since the day we lost him. It was in the shape of the sentences, in the careful balancing of justice and mercy, in the way he had tried one last time to teach his son that character mattered more than cash. That day, the chapter on my marriage ended for good. Another chapter opened in its place, one where my last name no longer meant wife of Chase, but the person Harlan believed could carry the weight he'd spent a lifetime building. My new apartment in Capitol Hill was 2 rooms and a narrow balcony, but the first time I stepped into it with my box of dishes and mismatched hangers, it felt huge. The living room window framed the Space Needle in the distance, small but defiantly bright against the gray sky. I set the framed copy of the key pages of Harlan's will on the table and just looked at it for a long time. It didn't feel like a lottery ticket. It felt like a letter from the dead asking me not to waste what he'd entrusted to me. News of Chase filtered to me in fragments. A former colleague mentioned over coffee that he'd tried to get his old sales job back and been turned down. "Too much baggage," she said delicately. They heard things about his spending, his temper. Someone else told me he'd landed at a small firm for a few weeks only to blow up at a client and quit before they could fire him. The $75,000 he'd actually inherited vanished faster than even I expected. Between the payday loans, the high-interest credit cards, the Vegas trips, and toys he'd charged in advance of his imaginary windfall, it barely put a dent in the pile. I knew because he left voicemail-slurred late-night messages that swung between begging and blame. "Lux, come on, one," started his voice hoarse. "You could refuse the whatever, that clause. You could tell them you don't want it. We could fix this." Another angrier. "You think you're better than me now. Sitting on my dad's money? You'd be nothing without him." I stopped listening after a while. I let his number go to voicemail and then eventually to blocked. The only thing I owed him at that point was distance. The foundation, on the other hand, demanded my presence. Walters walked me through the practicalities, board meetings, audits, grant reports. My role was not glamorous. It was reading spreadsheets until my eyes hurt, asking questions no one had bothered to ask when Harlan was there to answer them himself, visiting sites to make sure the glossy photos matched reality. I went to community centers in neighborhoods most people in Medina pretended not to know existed. I met program directors who spoke of Harlan with a mix of affection and awe. I sat on a worn bleacher while a teenage girl in an oversized hoodie described how the after-school tutoring program had kept her from dropping out. I watched a group of little kids in matching t-shirts shoot hoops in a gym that had once been a moldy warehouse. One trip took me back to Tacoma. The building there was unremarkable from the outside, a low concrete structure near the highway, but inside it hummed with life. A kitchen where volunteers cooked meals, classrooms with donated computers, a small counseling office with a line of kids outside the door. Standing in that hallway, I felt something loosen in my chest. This was the town where my life had blown apart. Yet here, in this place Harlan had fought to fund, other lives were being quietly stitched back together. At the end of that long day, Walters called with a final piece of the will he hadn't gone over in the conference room. "There was a personal bequest we didn't discuss with the others," he said. "Harlan wanted to keep that moment between you and the document. It was a separate clause, almost modest compared to the towering structures of the foundation language, a personal gift of $250,000 to me, with a few lines in his own words attached. He thanked me for seeing the man behind the money, for sitting with him in the evenings when the pain was bad, for challenging his son when Harlan no longer had the strength. Use this for your own life, not for mine," he'd written. "You've done enough carrying for other people." I cried then, alone in my little apartment, not because of the number, but because someone had finally put into writing what I had tried so hard to believe about myself, that I was worth more than what I gave, that I didn't exist solely as a support beam for everyone else. I didn't suddenly become rich. The foundation's assets were not mine to touch the way Chase had once imagined. They belonged to the kids in those gyms, the students in those computer labs, the people whose names Harlan would never know, but whose futures he'd helped tilt a few degrees toward better. My own money meant I could breathe. I paid off the last of the remnants Chase had dragged into my orbit. I built a cushion that was mine alone. For the first time since Eli's accident, the thought of a surprise expense didn't make my stomach drop. One evening, a few months into this new life, I came home to find Chase leaning against the brick wall outside my building. He looked smaller somehow, as if his body had finally caught up to the way the world now saw him. His clothes hung looser. His eyes were ringed with shadow. "Lux," he said, pushing himself upright. "I needed to talk to you." Every muscle in me tightened. "You shouldn't be here," I said. He spread his hands. "Just hear me out. Please. I messed up. I know I did. I was stupid and greedy and whatever else you want to call it. But we were something once. We can be again. You could tell them you don't want the job, the clause, any of it. We could go somewhere else. Start over." I looked at him. Really looked the way I hadn't in a long time. I saw the man who'd made me laugh in a conference bar, who'd held my hand when I talked about Eli. I also saw the man who'd dragged me into a parking lot after his father's funeral and told me I was useless now that his payday had come. "We are not a we anymore," I said quietly. "That ended the day you chose money you didn't even have over a marriage you actually did." He flinched like I'd slapped him. "People change," he said weakly. "I can change." "Maybe," I said. "Maybe you can. But that's your work to do, not mine to sponsor. The only thing I took from you is a lesson about who I will never be again." His eyes filled, and for a second I saw the boy who'd grown up in Harlan's shadow, always reaching for more. Tears slid down his face. I stepped around him toward the door. "Lux," he said, voice breaking. I paused with my hand on the buzzer. "Get help," I said without turning. "Not money. Help." Then I went inside. I didn't look back. Upstairs, I turned on the lamp at my small desk, the one that made the whole living room glow gold against the dark window. I opened my laptop and the draft document I'd been working on, a 3-year plan for the foundation's next phase. At the top of the page, above all the bullet points and timelines, I typed a single line: "Keep Harlan's promise." I sat back and let the words settle. I didn't have $1 billion to burn through on cars or trips or empty status. What I had was a responsibility to guard something bigger than me, and for the first time in a long time, a life that was truly my own. I had a modest apartment with a view of the city that had broken me and remade me, a bank account that was finally filled with money I'd earned, and money left to me by someone who saw my worth. A name that no longer felt tied to a man who resented it, but to a legacy I chose every day to honor. I didn't get the future I thought I wanted when I said yes on that rooftop in Portland. I got something messier, harder, and ultimately better. I got myself back.